In January of 1966, a captain in the Royal Australian Engineers was lowered headfirst into a hole in the ground by his sergeant, who had tied a rope around one of his legs. In one hand, he carried a torch. In the other, his pistol. Nobody had briefed him on what was down there because nobody knew. What he found across the next 6 days would create a new kind of soldier, alter the doctrine of an entire Allied army, and place in Allied hands the most important intelligence of the Vietnam War, intelligence subsequently described as the first Allied strategic intelligence victory of the conflict, and then buried in bureaucratic inaction until the opportunity it represented was gone. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of the Australian tunnel rats before today, because if you haven't, that is the first thing this story needs to address. To understand what one Australian engineering troop accomplished in the Hobo Woods in January of 1966, you first have to understand the war beneath the war. The one that had been running for 2 decades before any American combat soldier arrived in South Vietnam, and the one that no amount of air power, artillery, or conventional doctrine had been able to touch. The Viet Cong did not dig their tunnels in response to the American military buildup of 1965. The passages that would eventually run for hundreds of kilometers beneath the jungles of South Vietnam had their origins in the 1940s, when Vietnamese fighters opposing French colonial control began cutting refuges into the clay-rich soil north of Saigon. The Viet Minh understood early what every guerrilla force eventually learns, that survival against a technologically superior enemy requires invisibility, and that the most reliable form of invisibility is vertical. You do not hide beside the enemy. You hide below him. The soil in the Cu Choi district north of Saigon was almost ideally suited to this purpose. It contained clay and iron in proportions that produced, when dry, a binding agent approaching the structural properties of concrete. Tunnels cut into this earth during the monsoon season, when the ground was soft enough to work, hardened as they dried into passages that could withstand enormous external force. The testing of this fact was not theoretical. American planners would eventually confirm that a 750-pound bomb detonating 50 yards from a tunnel entrance had no measurable effect on either the tunnel or its occupants. That is not a structural failure. That is a design specification. By the time large-scale American combat operations began in 1965, some passages in the Cu Chi system were old enough to have moss growing on their walls. The network had been expanding for 15 years. It ran for what would eventually be confirmed as more than 200 kilometers. It descended to 4 levels, the lowest approaching the water table. Within its walls were operating hospitals, ammunition factories, print shops, command rooms, food stores, and in the larger nodes, spaces large enough to stage attacks on Saigon itself. American intelligence reports from the period described systems containing living quarters, kitchens, ordnance factories, hospitals, and bomb shelters, with some complexes including theaters and music halls. These were not foxholes. They were cities. The tactical logic of this infrastructure was precisely calibrated to defeat the American way of war. Viet Cong fighters spent daylight hours underground, in areas where artillery and airstrikes were most intense. At night, they emerged to conduct operations, gather supplies, and tend the crops that sustained them. When surface contact with American or South Vietnamese units occurred, the engagement typically lasted minutes before the enemy withdrew into the nearest tunnel entrance and vanished. American commanders described pursuing this force as equivalent to a large, lethal game of whack-a-mole across thousands of acres of jungle. The analogy was accurate and produced no solution. The Cu Chi irony arrived at a level of directness that approached parody. The United States constructed one of its major combat base camps directly on top of one of the largest tunnel complexes in South Vietnam. Soldiers were being killed from beneath the ground they slept on. Patrols operating from that base were tracked, targeted, and ambushed by fighters who moved through tunnels running below the patrol routes. The tunnel system was not adjacent to the American position. It was under it. The standard American response to a discovered tunnel entrance was consistent and consistently inadequate. Tear gas was pumped into the opening. Smoke grenades were thrown down the shaft. Hot tar was poured in. Where none of these produced results, which was almost always, a grenade was dropped and the entrance sealed with demolitions. The tunnels had been designed to defeat every one of these approaches. Trap doors too heavy for air pressure to lift. S-bends that trapped gas and smoke before it could penetrate the deeper system, functioning exactly as the S-bend in a domestic drain functions. The tunnel engineers of the 1940s had never heard of the mighty might blower or American tear gas. They had produced passages that neutralized both. General William Westmoreland's standing policy in 1965 was unambiguous: identify tunnel entrances and destroy them. Systematic entry was not part of the doctrine. The official position held that the tunnels were too dangerous, too unknown, and too narrow for organized clearance operations. That policy was not unreasonable given what was then known. What it failed to account for was the possibility that someone would go in anyway, and that going in would reveal a scale of enemy infrastructure that changed the calculus of the war. Before following that someone underground, it is necessary to understand who he was and how his troop came to be there. Alexander Hugh MacGregor, Sandy to everyone who served with him, was born in New Delhi on the 16th of March, 1940, where his father was serving in the Royal Australian Engineers. His grandfather and great-grandfather had also served in the Corps. When his family relocated to Ulverston in Tasmania, he was 8 years old. MacGregor graduated from the Royal Military College, Duntroon, in 1960, completed an engineering degree at the University of Sydney, and was given command of 3 Field Troop Royal Australian Engineers in 1965. It was his first active service command. He had 6 weeks to prepare the troop for deployment. The troop MacGregor was given was, in its composition, unlike any other Allied unit that would serve in Vietnam. Recruited entirely from regular volunteers, not conscripts, not national servicemen, not draftees. It was the only unit on the Allied side for which that distinction held. It had been drawn from 10 different parent units across the Australian Army, which meant its default social structure in those first weeks was a set of insular cliques organized around prior service. Men from 3 RAR did not yet know men from 1 RAR. Artillery NCOs did not yet trust infantry sappers. MacGregor's solution was blunt: cross-country runs continuously until the shared physical suffering at the direction of one man dissolved the smaller loyalties. If nothing else, they would be unified in their resentment of him. It worked eventually. It worked rather faster when they were at sea. In September of 1965, 3 Field Troop trudged up the gangplank of HMAS Sydney, a dilapidated aircraft carrier long overdue for decommissioning, en route to South Vietnam. MacGregor had flown ahead with his senior sergeant to prepare the way. The troop followed by sea, and it was aboard that ship, when they were a small contingent amid hundreds of others heading to the same war, that something began to change in the way they related to each other. They were 3 Field Troop. Other people were something else. Their expected role on arrival was standard combat engineering, road clearing, demining, destroying enemy facilities, and weapons caches found by the infantry. Nobody had mentioned tunnels. No training materials on tunnel entry and clearance existed, because no one in the Allied force had yet determined what such materials should contain. The mighty might blower that arrived with their equipment was understood to be the answer to tunnels. Pump smoke or tear gas through the entrance, wait, then collapse and move on. That was the procedure. That was all there was. The troop's unofficial motto had been inherited from the broader tradition of combat engineering. Facimus et frangimus. We make and we break. It covered road bridges, booby traps, tunnel entrances, and whatever else required demolition or construction. It did not specifically cover the discovery of an underground city beneath a jungle clearing 20 kilometers north of Cu Chi. That situation required improvisation. 3 Field Troop turned out to have a particular aptitude for it. Operation Crimp was, at the time of its launch on the 8th of January, 1966, the largest Allied military action mounted in South Vietnam. The first operation fought at divisional level. 8,000 troops, 6 battalions, commanded by Major General Jonathan O. Seaman of the United States 1st Infantry Division. The 173rd Airborne Brigade, under Brigadier General Ellis Williamson, provided the assault force. The U.S. 3rd Infantry Brigade screened to the south. The operational objective was the headquarters of the Viet Cong's Military Region 4, the nerve center directing enemy operations in and around Saigon, believed to be somewhere within a 12-square-mile area of jungle and marshland known as the Hobo Woods. Still attached to the 173rd Airborne Brigade, as they had been since their arrival in June of 1965, was the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Alex Preece. Supporting 1 RAR were elements of the Royal Australian Artillery, M113 armored personnel carriers from the Prince of Wales Light Horse, and MacGregor's 3 Field Troop. The Australians were assigned the northern blocking position, the flank that would prevent the enemy from withdrawing north, while the American battalions swept through from west and south. The morning before the assault, 1 RAR's operations officer, Major John Essex Clark, conducted an aerial reconnaissance over the planned landing zone. An absence of ground cover suggested to him a significant prepared defensive position below. He recommended a different landing site. The recommendation was accepted. MacGregor would later assess that decision as one that almost certainly saved hundreds of Australian lives. The original landing site was the Viet Cong headquarters itself. B-52 bombers had pre-struck the area on the 7th of January, turning the once dense jungle into a pock-marked moonscape. At 5:30 on the morning of the 8th, the assault went in. The Australians landed and immediately encountered the Viet Cong security battalions, the Quiet Thang Regiment, and the Cu Chi 7th in the northern blocking position. It was a fight from the moment the helicopters set down. Across those first days of fighting, as 1 RAR secured its position and patrols moved through the area, tunnel entrances began appearing. Dozens of them, hidden under leaf litter, beneath cooking pots, in the walls of abandoned structures, in the floors of cleared buildings. The standard procedure was applied: smoke grenades, tear gas, demolitions. The procedure produced what it always produced. The enemy was still somewhere below, and the tunnels kept going. At one entrance, a Viet Cong soldier emerged, not to surrender, but to fire. 2 Australians were killed. 2 more were wounded. The smoke pumped down the shaft had driven nobody out. MacGregor was called forward to advise on how to deal with the tunnel entrances appearing across the Australian position. He looked at the holes in the ground. He looked at the available equipment. He asked the question that defined what happened next. Does anybody know what is down there? Nobody did. Nobody had been down to look. MacGregor's sergeant tied a rope around his commanding officer's leg. MacGregor took a torch in one hand and his pistol in the other. He was lowered in. The passage went down approximately 2 meters, turned through a U-bend back toward the surface, then ran horizontally into a darkness further than the torch could illuminate. The air was breathable. A large man could not navigate the passage without difficulty. A man of ordinary frame could crawl through it, slowly, in near total darkness, with no knowledge of what lay ahead, what the tunnel connected to, or whether anyone waited beyond the next bend. MacGregor crawled through it. What 3 Field Troop found over the following 4 days was not a network of fighting positions. Corporal Lex McAuley, a 1963 graduate of the Australian Defence Language School and the only Vietnamese language specialist in 1 RAR, a man whose entire training had prepared him precisely for this kind of intelligence exploitation, was on the surface receiving what emerged from the passages below. He could only glance briefly at each bundle of documents, tag it with date, capturing unit, and location, and direct it to the landing zone. There was too much material to do otherwise. Documents assessed quickly, as unimportant, were burned on a nearby fire. Later, nobody could be certain the quick assessments were always correct. The underground complex was the Viet Cong's command headquarters for all operations against Saigon, Bien Hoa, and the surrounding provinces. The system descended to 4 levels, each accessed through trapdoors concealed in the floor of the level above. Some passages were newly cut, the clay still damp at the walls. Others were old enough that moss had established itself in the corners, meaning they predated any American presence in Vietnam. Rooms contained typewriters, printing presses, cameras, and radio equipment. Ammunition stores and medical supplies occupied chambers the search teams found on the 2nd and 3rd days. A functioning headquarters, not a shelter. A city. MacGregor organized the search by the only systematic method available to men who had never done this before. Teams of 3 and 4, entering with telephone wire paid out behind them as they went. The lead man checked for booby traps. The second maintained contact with the surface by field telephone, relaying position and findings in real time. The men at the rear sat at corners, keeping the wire clear of snags. A map was being constructed from descriptions given in darkness by men feeling their way through passages the surface commander could not see. Then, on the 11th of January, 1966, an Australian sapper crawled out of a tunnel dragging a leather satchel fastened with 2 straps and 2 buckles. McAuley opened it. Arranged in columns across large sheets of paper, the product of years of careful administrative work, were real names, code names, dates of birth, places of origin, occupations in civilian life, Communist Party membership details, and party seniority, and current assignments within the Viet Cong organization in the Saigon district. Every operative, every contact, every cell, by name, by address, by function. McAuley carried the satchel to Lieutenant Colonel Preece and told him plainly what it contained and what it meant. It went to MACV. It was translated. The briefings to Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Ambassador Averill Harriman covered it. Major General Joseph McChristian, Westmoreland's Chief of Intelligence, visited the Australian unit during the operation and saw directly what had been recovered. Official accounts of Operation Crimp, when eventually published, called it the first Allied strategic intelligence victory of the war. Before the satchel reached Preece, something else had happened on that same 4th day. Corporal Robert Walter Bowtell was born on the 25th of April, 1932, at Turramurra in New South Wales, the son of Albert and Eva Bowtell. He grew up in the Blue Mountains and attended Katoomba High School, leaving in 1948 to serve a carpentry apprenticeship. 5 years into that trade, he changed to painting, and then wanted something beyond both and applied for enlistment in the Australian Army. His first attempt was rejected. He tried again on the 10th of July, 1959, and succeeded. He served initially as a rifleman with 4 RAR and then with 3 RAR, where he was posted to Brisbane in March of 1960. Not long after arriving, he met a woman named Josephine. After what the records describe as a whirlwind romance, they married on the 2nd of July. 3 children followed: Michael, Susan, and Peter. In 1963, Bowtell transferred to the 1st Field Engineer Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, qualified as a combat engineer, and was promoted to corporal in May of 1964. he deployed to Sabah in Malaysia, carried out road construction tasks, and returned to Australia in June of 1965. In August, he transferred to 3 Field Troop. In September, he boarded HMAS Sydney with the rest of the troop. By that point, Josephine was expecting their 4th child. He was 184 centimeters tall. In the passages below the Hobo Woods, that was not an advantage. On the 11th of January, smoke and tear gas had been pumped through one of the tunnel systems before entry, as the troop had been doing throughout the operation. The gas had been allowed time to work. What had not been adequately accounted for was the depletion of oxygen that followed in the confined passage. Bowtell decided to take his turn. The rope went around his leg. He went in. His body, moving through the tunnel, prevented air from circulating around him. The oxygen was already partially consumed. The tear gas residue had not cleared. He reached a trapdoor between levels, a gap approximately 2 meters below the surface, and became wedged in it. Frantic efforts were made to dig a shaft beside the tunnel by hand, to widen access from above. The shaft was taking too long. Private Jim Daly volunteered to go in after him. Daly entered 4 times, and worked until he was almost incapable of further movement. He was ordered out by his platoon commander before he could reach Bowtell. Sapper Alan Sparrow Christie, 45 kilograms, the man with the best physical chance of fitting through the gap, went in and was overcome by the same depleted air that had stopped Bowtell. He was dragged out unconscious. By the time they reached Bowtell from above, he had dislodged his respirator in his efforts to free himself. He was dead. His body was taken to Malaysia and buried at Tarandak Cemetery with full military honors. In May of 1966, Josephine gave birth to their 4th child. She named him Robert. Christie's account of trying and failing to reach Bowtell was given 50 years after the fact. The death of Bob Bowtell, he said, was the most traumatic event he experienced in his entire lifetime. More than anything else that followed across 9 further months of Vietnam operations. He had carried it since January of 1966 as a weight he could not put down. The Bowtell children eventually found him at the repatriation ceremony in June of 2016 and thanked him. He said the encounter had helped him put 50 years of haunting to rest. That ceremony was when Bowtell's remains finally came home. He had been in Malaysia since the 11th of January, 1966. The troop continued. Not one man refused to go back into the tunnels. Over the 6 days of Operation Crimp, 3 field troops suffered 6 casualties by asphyxiation. 1 death, 5 injuries. The cause was recorded in after-action reports as bad air. The more precise explanation, as subsequent Australian Army analysis has established, is that the tear gas and smoke pumped through the mighty mite blower consumed available oxygen, and the troop had not yet developed the procedure of flushing fresh air through before entry. They were building their doctrine in real time, and the building had costs. It also produced results that nothing else in the Allied order of battle had managed. Major General Seaman concluded on the 14th of January that the force lacked the resources to continue exploring the full extent of the system. Westmoreland needed the combat units elsewhere. President Johnson had ordered a halt to offensive operations for the Tet Lunar New Year truce. The Australians who wanted to stay were pulled out. The tunnel complex they had partially mapped remained functional, because clearing it completely had been beyond the available time and the available men. The final accounting of what Operation Crimp produced, in the Australian sector alone, ran to more than 10 miles of tunnels explored, more than 100,000 pages of documents, 90 heavy weapons, and tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition. 8 Australians had been killed and 30 wounded. 14 Americans had been killed and 76 wounded. Enemy casualties were confirmed at 128 killed, with estimates placing a further 190 probably killed, 92 captured, and more than 500 suspects detained. The leather satchel and its contents went forward to Mac Vu and to the South Vietnamese intelligence apparatus. What happened to them afterward belongs to the part of the record that does not want to discuss itself. On the 15th of January, the 173rd Airborne's commander went to Saigon to brief Secretary of State Rusk and Ambassador Harriman. Senior officers attended an international press conference. At that press conference, MacGregor was asked to describe what his men had been doing in the tunnels. He used the term he considered accurate: tunnel ferrets, the ferret being the animal traditionally used in Australia and Britain to flush rabbits from their burrows. The journalist recording his remarks had never heard the word ferret used in that sense. He wrote tunnel rats. No correction was issued. The name stuck. There is a dispute about the naming that the Australian Army's own history does not fully resolve. Veterans of 1 RAR have argued, with documentation, that infantry soldiers of their battalion were entering and searching tunnel sections for at least a day before 3 Field Troop systematic work began. Primary accounts from 1 RAR officers describe crawling through passages during the initial fighting. The Australian War Memorial has adopted the engineering troops account as primary. What is not in dispute is what 3 Field Troop did across 6 days. The mapping methodology, the intelligence extraction, the documented haul, the continuity of effort under fire, and in conditions that killed one of their number and injured 5 others. Whether an infantryman entered a hole on the first day is a different question from whether anyone had a doctrine, a method, or a sustainable approach before MacGregor's teams began paying out telephone wire. The record holds both accounts. It does not resolve them. What Westmoreland did with the Australian demonstration was issue a new order, countermanding previous policy. All tunnels were to be systematically entered, searched, and cleared. A specialized volunteer force would be established across Allied units to perform this function. They would be called by the name the American journalist had coined at the Saigon press conference: the Tunnel Rats. Within months, U.S. divisions were forming dedicated tunnel clearance teams. By 1969, the 1st Engineer Battalion had permanent tunnel rat rotations through the Siu Chai district. The techniques those teams developed drew directly from what 3 Field Troop had improvised in January: telephone wire for orientation, compass bearings at every turn, 2-man teams with defined roles, red-lensed torches because the Viet Cong used only white light and the distinction mattered in the dark, a maximum of 3 shots before reloading, and an agreed-upon tune whistled on exit, so a mud-covered figure climbing out of a hole would not be shot by his own sentries. Every procedure in that doctrine had been invented by men who had never entered a tunnel before the 8th of January, 1966. The American program produced notable figures of its own. Staff Sergeant Pedro Rejo Ruiz, known as the Human Probe, a Cuban immigrant who had been defying communist forces since his teenage years in Havana, served 2 extra tours and was placed by the Viet Cong on their top 10 most wanted list alongside Sergeant Robert Bowtell. Captain Herbert Thornton, the Chemical Corps officer who formalized the first organized U.S. tunnel teams, is described in American accounts of the war as the father of the tunnel rats. Thornton was organizing those teams during Operation Crimp, after the Australians had been underground for 6 days. This sequence appears in no American account that has achieved any circulation. It doesn't appear to have been sought. After 3 Field Troop rotated home in September of 1966, 1st Field Squadron, 3 troops designated 1, 2, and 3, took up the work and continued it for 6 more years, until the last Australian engineers left South Vietnam in 1972. The unit that replaced MacGregor's volunteers was larger and drew from a wider recruiting base, but operated in the same terrain, against the same tunnels, the same mines, and the same booby-trapped rice caches, with the same fundamental equipment. a torch, a pistol, a bayonet, a spool of telephone wire, and the accumulated knowledge of whoever had been down before and come back to explain what they had found. At most, 120 men from the Australian field troops were in country at any one time. Over the 7 years of the program, approximately 700 men served in the role. 36 were killed. Approximately 200 were wounded. 1 in 3 was hit. Most of the dead, accounting for more than 50% of Australian casualties in Vietnam at the peak of the war, were not killed inside tunnels. They fell above ground, on mines and booby traps in the same landscape that had produced the tunnel systems, doing the work that fell to the men sent ahead of the infantry to clear the earth before others walked on it. Jim Marrett arrived in Vietnam on the 11th of June, 1969, joining CAF Troop 1 Field Squadron at Nui Dat. His first corporal, Jeff Handley, warned him out 2 days into his tour for Operation Esso, a month-long stint at the base of the Long Hai Mountains with 5 RAR. Handley helped him kit out with packs, webbing, rations, weapons, and ammunition, and showed him what to discard as unnecessary weight. What stayed with Merritt was the shock of the open access to weapons, ammunition, and explosives compared to Australia, where these items had all been tightly controlled. In Vietnam, it was open slather, in his words. Within a few operations, each tunnel rat had accumulated a substantial personal stash of C4 plastic explosive. Operation Pinaroo was conducted in the Long Hai Hills over 7 weeks from the 2nd of March to the 12th of April, 1968. 60 Australian casualties. 9 were tunnel rats. 4 of those 9 were killed in action. The Long Hai Hills were the home ground of the Viet Cong's D445 Battalion and the C-25 Company, who called the area the Min Dam's Secret Zone and used it as the staging base for attacks on the Australian task force at Nui Dat and on American positions throughout Phuoc Tuy Province. The Australians knew the hills well enough to regard everything within them as either mined or booby-trapped, usually with anti-lift devices. The knowledge gave the danger a shape. It did not remove it. Sapper Bob O'Connor articulated the psychology the work required in June of 1968, while excavating a 155mm artillery shell by hand in the Long Hai Hills, 4.5 hours into the job, explaining himself to a new man on his first operation who had asked how you did something like this. "No one is going to force you to do this kind of stuff," O'Connor told him. "So if it's not for you, ask for a transfer. But if you decide to stay, you've got to believe, and I mean really believe, that you're already dead. Once you accept that, the job gets much easier. It even becomes a challenge. Nothing to do with the Army. It's a personal thing." Those words are not in any citation. They are in the Holdfast newsletter, published by the Vietnam Tunnel Rats Association in Toorak, Victoria. That is where this kind of accounting lives, not because it was hidden, but because the system that produces citations was not built to see it. 5 military medals and 1 military cross were awarded to the Australian tunnel rats across 7 years. 36 killed, 200 wounded, 33% casualties, 5 medals. The Australian Army's own professional development publication has assessed this as extraordinarily low for a unit operating under such sustained high risk, noting that the under-recognition reflects more on the rationing of awards than on what the men experienced. That observation is accurate. It does not make the arithmetic easier to read. Jim Marrett received no award for his year in Vietnam. 44 years after his tour ended, the Governor-General of Australia granted him an Order of Australia Medal in 2014 for his subsequent work with veterans, specifically for founding and sustaining the Vietnam Tunnel Rats Association. The recognition for the advocacy came. The recognition for the year it was based on did not. What happened to the leather satchel and its contents is the part of the story the official record most consistently declines to address. The documents were translated. MACV intelligence staff assessed them with something approaching disbelief at their scope. Major General McChristian, having visited the Australians during Operation Crimp and seen what had been recovered, initiated an intense program of enemy information collection in and around Saigon. The assessment confirmed what the satchel had already shown. The Viet Cong's clandestine organization in Saigon was intact, functional, well-staffed, and operating with almost no interference from the South Vietnamese security apparatus. Acting on that knowledge was another matter. In January of 1966, there was no combined U.S. and South Vietnamese document exploitation office. All captured documents remained property of the South Vietnamese government. The South Vietnamese could be advised. They could not be compelled. The Combined Exploitation Center did not open until October of 1966, 9 months after the satchel was retrieved. The follow-up operation aimed at the Viet Cong infrastructure in the Saigon region was not launched until December of 1966, nearly a year after the intelligence that should have driven it was in hand. Responsibility for Saigon's internal security remained South Vietnamese. The city itself was not included in the operation's scope. The Viet Cong infrastructure in Saigon, barely interrupted through those 11 months, rebuilt what it needed to rebuild and planned what it needed to plan. In January of 1968, the Tet Offensive was launched, coordinated from Saigon by the organization whose complete membership had been recorded in that leather satchel 2 years before. Westmoreland did not mention Operation Crimp in his end-of-tour report in 1968. He did not mention it in his memoirs in 1976. McChristian published a monograph on military intelligence in Vietnam in 1974. Operation Crimp is not in it. McAuley, the linguist who identified the satchel's contents in the field, has maintained for decades that if the information had been used immediately, if the Viet Cong infrastructure in Saigon had been systematically dismantled through 1966, the organizational capacity for the Tet Offensive could not have been assembled. The argument is contested. The timeline is not. The personnel file for every significant Viet Cong operative in the Saigon district was in Allied hands on the 11th of January, 1966. The organization those names represented launched a coordinated assault on the capital 2 years later. The tunnels themselves were not finally destroyed until 1970. American B-52 bombers, released from operations against North Vietnam as the war's strategic calculus shifted, began dropping delayed fuse munitions that penetrated deep into the earth before detonating. The passages that had survived artillery, chemical attacks, and 5 years of everything else the Allied force attempted collapsed under bombs specifically designed to reach them. The physical work that 3 Field Troop had begun mapping in January of 1966 was completed from altitude in 1970, 4 years after the Australians first went in. The term tunnel rat, in most of the histories that carry it, is understood as an American contribution to the Vietnam War. The American program, its notable figures, its formal recognition, its place in the memoir literature, has become the primary association the world holds. The men of 3 Field Troop and 1 Field Squadron, the unit that created the concept, improvised the doctrine, suffered the first casualties, and named the discipline tunnel ferrets before being renamed by a journalist who had never seen a ferret, occupy a footnote in most accounts of the conflict. They occupy no position at all in most American ones. National memories are not always rational about which stories they carry forward. The innovation that travels further than the innovator is not unusual in military history. That it happened here and in this direction is documented. It is not what those men spent 60 years contesting. It is simply what occurred. Sandy MacGregor returned to Vietnam in 1998, The former political commissar of the Viet Cong forces in Cu Chi had arranged for a colonel, who had himself been in the tunnels during Operation Crimp, to act as MacGregor's guide through the complex. MacGregor walked back through the passages his teams had mapped from inside 32 years before, and met former Viet Cong soldiers who had been on the other side of the darkness. The first officer to enter the enemy's underground city spent an afternoon being shown around by the people who built it. On the 23rd of January, 1987, 21 years after Operation Crimp, 3 of MacGregor's daughters from his first marriage and a friend were shot dead by a man named Richard Madrell, a paranoid schizophrenic infatuated with one of them. In the years that followed, MacGregor reached for the same internal discipline that had allowed him to descend a tunnel in 1966, having accepted the likelihood of not returning. He ran seminars, he wrote books, he appeared on radio. In an interview with Margaret Throsby, she asked him directly whether he had forgiven Madrell. "Yes," he said, "I have forgiven him." 454 people rang the radio station after that broadcast. Some were angry, believing forgiveness dishonored his daughters. MacGregor said, "Forgiveness is for the forgiver, not for the forgiven." That in moving forward, not in carrying anger, he was honoring them. The man who trained himself in January of 1966 to proceed as though he were already dead had, in the decades since, applied that same training to every confrontation that required it. It remained, in his words, a personal thing. Bowtell's swing bridge spans the Cox River on the 6-foot track in the Blue Mountains, the country where Robert Bowtell grew up, between Katoomba and the Jenolan Caves. It was built by 3-troop, 1-field squadron, Royal Australian Engineers in 1991 and officially opened on the 23rd of April, 1992. It was named for the first tunnel rat killed in the Vietnam War. At the official opening, the first person to cross it was Bowtell's grandson. He later enlisted in the Royal Australian Engineers and served in Afghanistan. He has crossed his grandfather's bridge. On the 2nd of June, 2016, Bowtell's remains came home to Australia from Tarandak Cemetery as part of a repatriation that included 32 other veterans and dependents. Alan Sparrow Christie attended the ceremony. The Bowtell children came to find him and thanked him for what he had tried to do on the 11th of January, 1966. He said the encounter had helped him put the weight of that day down. After 50 years, he said, he could set it down. The Vietnam Tunnel Rats Association, based in Toorak, Victoria, publishes the Holdfast newsletter 4 times a year. Its membership roll carries the name of every man who served with 3 field troop and 1, 2, and 3 troop of 1 field squadron in South Vietnam. Names marked RIP are not few. The association has held 7 official tours back to Vietnam. Its members placed 36 individual wreaths at the former site of 1 field squadron's headquarters at Nui Dat, 1 for each man killed. The Cu Chi tunnels are a tourist attraction today. Visitors crawl through passages that have been widened to accommodate Western frames, guided by recorded commentary explaining how this underground system sustained a force that defeated the most powerful military in the world. The passages are lit now. They have been smoothed and shortened to something manageable for people who have not considered that they might already be dead. The ground absorbs this without complaint. Sandy MacGregor, born in New Delhi on the 16th of March, 1940, is 86 years old. He still wears his medals on Anzac Day. In January of 1966, his sergeant tied a rope around his leg and lowered him into a tunnel with a torch, a pistol, and no knowledge of what was below. He was the first anti-communist officer to enter the Viet Cong's underground city. The Americans gave the doctrine a different name, built a larger program around it, and recorded the origin elsewhere. If this story belongs somewhere beyond the footnote, where it has spent the last 60 years, tell someone who has not heard it. The rope around his leg. That is where it started.